Alrighty, welcome everyone to the Climate Action Symposium. We are absolutely thrilled to have you all with us here today. So to get started, my name is Ali Howe. I am a sophomore at Cornell University and social media director for a grassroots organization called TIAA Divest. And I'm also the team lead of this symposium. On behalf of, again, the Cornell Advocacy Project, we'd like to welcome you to our inaugural Climate Action Symposium. We're absolutely thrilled that you've taken the time out of your day to join us. So thank you. So today we're going to talk about how to use storytelling and community advocacy as tools for sustainable change in our fight to address the climate crisis. We have an amazing group of speakers here for you today. But first, let me provide you all with a bit of background on the Advocacy Project, or AdPro. We are a network of undergraduates here at Cornell University who are working to spread advocacy skills to anyone and everyone with an internet connection. We host a variety of advocacy-related events, including this one, and we provide resources to help people like you and me develop our advocacy. So for more information about us, please check out our website, which was just posted in the chat, the link, so you can go there. Regarding the structure of today's symposium, we already have some questions prepared to kick the conversation off. There will be a designated Q&A section at the end, but we encourage you to please send us your questions throughout. We'd love to hear from you. To hear, so that we can hear from you, to submit your questions, please direct message Rachel. Her name is Rachel, parentheses questions. If there's any confusion, and just send her a few questions in the chat as they come up for you. And if you have any tech concerns or logistical concerns, please let Margot know in the chat. And so with that, I will pass it off to our remarkable speakers. So here today we have Dr. Caroline Levine. She's a professor at Cornell University within the College of Arts and Sciences, and she focuses on the humanities and looking at how storytelling can be used for positive change. And here she's going to bring us her expertise to talk about how that can be related to the climate crisis. We have Dr. Robert Howarth, who too is a professor here at Cornell University, who is an expert in the ecological sciences and has loads of experience, not only in academia, but also in state policy. Next, we have Ms. Destiny Watford. She is here with us. She is an environmental activist who is a 2016 Goldman Environmental Prize winner. She and her fellow high schoolers helped prevent the state's largest incinerator from being constructed a mile from her high school. And truly impressive, had 22 of the investors pull out and prevented its construction. So we are absolutely thrilled to have you all here today. But if you'd like to add something that I missed and say hello, please go ahead and unmute. And if not, we will get started. Is that good? Can I get a thumbs up, please? We're awesome. Awesome. Great. Thank you. So now transitioning to our questions. As we said before, we already have some prepared, but again, please feel free to include those in the chat. But so to get started, one question we would just like to ask to our panelists is, when was the first time that you felt personally impacted by the climate crisis? And what events prompted you to get involved in environmental activism?
Should we just jump in, or how do you want to call on
us? Go ahead. I would say jump in, so okay. Everyone's free to contribute.
Well, let me give you a short answer. When I was an undergraduate student back in the early 1970s, I started to get worried about environmental issues. It was soon after the first Earth Day. I was actually one of the organizers of the first Earth Day in the state of New Hampshire as a high school student, and went off to college thinking I wanted to do that sort of thing. And I ended up being a scientist, and it was part because I did a summer internship as an undergraduate student. I worked with an extraordinary scientist named George Woodwell, who back in 1973 was talking about climate change and its urgency and how protecting the Amazon rainforest was critical to our future. And I thought, man, that's what I want to do. I want to do science where you pull information together, but you also deal with real world issues and you put it out. So he and other scientists like him, who I've gone out of my way to sort of train under over the years, became my role model. And my goal all along has been a scientist, again, to pull together information, but to take it into the policy world, take it into the advocacy world. And I've been concerned about and worried about climate change since 1973.
Wonderful. Professor Levine, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm inclined to give the floor to Destiny because I think that story is going to be the most exciting one, but I'll go real fast. I feel like I am a sort of latecomer to environmental politics. I didn't have much awareness of what was going on around climate change until the very late 1990s, probably. And I told Allie one time that for me, the biggest wake-up call, the most devastating experience was watching Hurricane Katrina unfold on television and watching the incredible levels of suffering. And I kept thinking, somebody has to be able to come along and save people from this kind of, from thirst, from being drowned in their own home. Like we've got to have the capacity to help people in this. And I'd been at a conference in New Orleans a couple of years before, and in the conference center in New Orleans, people were sleeping and trying to hide out from Katrina, and they were also being shot because there was just like no protection for anybody. So you saw these moms with babies, no diapers, the toilets overflowing, nobody was there to help them. And then the most shocking moment for me was somebody from the government came and took these British nationals out of the Superdome and flew them home. And I was like, well, if they could do that, surely they could save the other people who are suffering. Like, it just felt to me like such a failure to save people from suffering. So I think that's where I got really energized.
And one thing I'll just add, when we were also having that conversation, you mentioned that at the time you were a mom. And so while you were holding your baby, you saw these mothers who couldn't find diapers that you had, in the room, which is extraordinarily powerful. Destiny, go ahead, Miss Watford.
Yeah, so I grew up in a overwhelmingly polluted environment in my community, but I didn't realize how huge the climate crisis was until my friends and I started doing research about the incinerator, and we realized like how bad our community was. Like, we had some of the highest air pollution in the nation, and we were one small community in Baltimore, and this was just an example of how huge the problem was. At the same time, there were like wildfires were exploding in California. There were like horrible hurricanes and heat waves in the Middle East. And so all of these things were happening at the same time. And it was a rude awakening.
Yeah, no, definitely. And thank you all for sharing your stories. I think everyone here in some way or another has been impacted by the climate crisis, certainly to different extents. But it's important to recognize that in the just plethora of ways that it can influence you. And you may not even realize it, or you may not realize that your community is being marginalized or exploited. And so with that, thank you. Thank you for the introductions. Now we're going to transition to a video clip from the beginning of the Leaders Summit on Climate, which was hosted by the Biden administration. So this, as we were just giving our intros, this is the intro to their summit. So Margot is going to go ahead and share her screen with you all, and we're gonna take a look.
All of a sudden, we can see the whole sphere, a great, gigantic blue ball covered with a white lace of clouds. It was spectacular.
You see the curve of the Earth, and you see that the atmosphere is so tiny and thin compared to this planet. And you understand that, wow, there's not that much there that's protecting us from the vacuum of space.
Here you are going 17,000 miles an hour over this incredibly beautiful planet. And here's this thin blue iridescent band, this little bitty thin atmosphere, everything that enables life to exist on this amazing ball of rock flying through space.
Our planet is changing. Since the late 19th century, the Earth has already warmed at least 1 degree Celsius. And we are seeing the devastating impacts. More severe weather, catastrophic events, and challenges to our lives and livelihoods. How much warmer our planet gets and how severe the impacts will be is up to us. The next decade is critical. We must change the course we're on in order to limit the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we succeed, we will protect the most vulnerable, preserve ecosystems and wildlife, reduce our exposure to extreme heat and storms, create a healthier, more equitable world, and create new economic opportunities for all. The challenges are clear, but so are the solutions. The question is, how do we move fast enough to keep the world on track to limit the rise in global temperatures?
In my view, we've already waited too long to deal with this climate crisis. We can't wait any longer.
How do we make bigger, bolder changes than ever before?
Governments must deliver the transformational change our world needs and that people demand with much stronger ambition.
How do we create new economic opportunities and ensure a just transition?
Certainly, we face an unprecedented crisis, but also an unprecedented opportunity to build back better, a healthier, more productive, and more resilient societies. We must step up to this challenge.
How do we create a more sustainable future for people and the planet?
I'm emboldened by my faith that together, with compassion and commitment, we can all emerge from the present storm transformed.
We know we must, and we know the time to act is now. We must go faster and further than ever before.
To bring countries of the world together to raise ambition and meet this moment. That's the only way for the world to succeed together.
This is how we solve the climate crisis. Together.
So thank you, Margot, for sharing your screen. I don't know about you all, but I found that opening extraordinarily mesmerizing, harrowing, but also empowering. And as the narrator said, it's up to us. It's time to act. We can't wait any longer. And so that's hopefully what this symposium will help each and every one of us do, is figure out what are the actions that we can take right after the symposium, a week from today, and in the future, to continue to be a part of that change and a part of that progress. And so specifically, we're going to focus on how that change can be affected through advocacy. And so throughout the symposium, we're going to kind of build and look at the different components of advocacy, starting with just the basics, talking to people, storytelling, to then how you can use stories to mobilize different communities and individuals, the importance of collaboration and compromise, and then going on from that, going from the more individual level and the interpersonal level to the community and institutional level and to the policy level. And then we're going to come back around to the Biden administration and talk a bit about what they've proposed thus far. So starting off with storytelling. One thing I guess I'll also add, we're assuming that everyone here understands the severity of the climate crisis and the need for action. So this is designed for people who want to do something, and we hope that we help you do that today. So now the question for our panelists. All of you have been involved in environmental justice and climate activism, and that involves talking to people. So how do you enter into a conversation with someone who may hold preconceptions about the climate crisis or not necessarily take it as seriously as you would hope? And then what are some of the barriers that you face when trying to enter into that conversation, and how do you adapt? And whoever would like to go first, go ahead.
I guess I can start. So I learned how to talk to people about the climate crisis the hard way, because I did a lot of like, here are the facts, here are the statistics, here's my example of what happened in my community, but that is sometimes hard for people to digest because it's a lot and it's overwhelming. So what I learned is that instead, when we are talking to people about the crisis, they need to be doing the talking, because everyone has experienced a consequence of the crisis, whether it comes in the form of asthma or flooding, etc., in one form or another. And so listening to their stories and hearing them talk about what they've already experienced, but maybe never thought about with that crisis lens, was really important for us, into understanding how everyone is affected by this issue.
That's wonderful. Professor Levine or Professor Howarth?
Sure. I mean, Destiny's exactly right as far as I understand it from the research, that if you want to persuade people, throwing facts at them, if they're not already interested in that, is not going to work. And even telling your own story, which is something we'll talk about, doesn't always work. But asking them to tell their story can really work, and getting people to reflect on their own experiences that they don't even realize are they haven't connected the dots, but they do so in storytelling. So that seems to be like one of the very best ways. I have to say, I'm a person who gets really impatient with people who don't pay attention to the facts. And so I have to really work hard to close my mouth and invite other people to talk who are not already persuaded. So the discipline involved, I find very hard.
Those are really both great answers. You know, my perspective is different. What I do is a little bit different, because I'm a scientist, and so I mostly am dealing with facts. I'm mostly throwing facts at people, right? I fully understand we need to have that engagement and communication, but you know, much of what I do as a scientist is to try and build consensus among my peers as to what those facts are, so that we can message them out. And particularly on climate change, I've worked on other environmental issues too, but particularly in climate change, there have been all these competing issues out there. There's this doomism, it's overwhelming, you can't do anything about it. And so I and other scientists try to counter that with telling the story, if you will, but through facts of, no, it's never too late. Boy, it's really too bad we didn't start working on this 20 years ago, but we didn't. It's better now than not. And so but as an individual, just saying that doesn't mean much. But if I can help build a consensus of other scientists and we continually message that, then it influences the press and the rest of the world hears it, right? So that's part of the strategy. I think there are also a huge number of what I like to call false solutions out there. And I'll just give you one example, because I've spent 10 years of my life working on it. Going back a decade or so ago, the natural gas industry started this idea that the solution to climate change was to get rid of coal and just substitute in natural gas as a bridge fuel. And that would allow us to eventually, 30, 50 years into the future, move into something else, but it would slow things down. Don't worry, the natural gas has it under control. You know, it was a false narrative, and it's dangerous for people to have accepted that. So I've worked heavily on the science, on the details, in a very controversial way going back 10 or so years ago. But at this point, you know, most scientists would agree with me that that's nonsense. We've developed the science as to why it's nonsense, and that messaging has gotten out. So for example, a few days ago on Sunday, a week ago, 6 days ago, New York Times ran a big feature article on we have to deal with methane, and a lot of it's coming from natural gas. And they explicitly said natural gas is not a bridge fuel. Well, that's because I and other scientists have been consistently messaging that for 10 years. And people are paying attention. There's a beautiful quote in the thing from Senator Schumer. Well, you know, I've never met Senator Schumer, though he's been my senator forever here. I've talked to the staff over the years. You know, off the record, I haven't seen a huge amount of, this isn't off the record, it's public, but I haven't seen a huge amount of interest over the years. You talk to him anyway, but Senator Schumer now gets it. So in this New York Times article, he goes, boy, methane, and methane's coming from natural gas, remember? Boy, that methane, it's like carbon dioxide on steroids. So, you know, that changes the political argument. And it's a mixture of storytelling, but it's not, you know, storytelling has a negative connotation to a scientist because it sounds like you're making stuff up and we have to deal in facts. But messaging is what we do, and consistency in messaging and pulling together a coherency across scientists is, to me, one of the most powerful ways that a scientist can engage in advocacy.
Yeah, no, I think all of your comments are amazing. And I think going to and the reason I'm calling them professor, for those who don't know, they're both my professors. So I had a course in communicating climate change from Professor Levine, and a course in evolution taught by Professor Howarth. So that's why I call them professor. But going to Professor Howarth's point, I think facts are, and you know, storytelling, yes, we have a negative connotation in the scientific community, but facts are key. They're the foundation that upon which the stories can be used to communicate those facts to the relevant stakeholders and the people that we need to be involved in the solution in order to change those numbers that we're seeing on the graph. So thank you very much. And now we actually have our first question, which does relate to what we were just talking about from an audience member. But we were talking about, and I think Destiny, you mentioned this, the importance of personal relevance when you're talking about the climate crisis, because it can seem so big and so psychologically distant. You know, yes, there are polar bears in the North Pole and it's melting, but how does that impact my life if I'm working, you know, in the local community store? And so one question we have from our audience is, how effective are videos like the one we just saw and actually changing people's attitudes or promoting action? Because it is at a very macro scale. So thank you to the audience member. And what are your responses?
Let me just take a first stab at that, but I want to hear from Destiny and Carolyn for sure. Have a better sense probably of how it would influence people. I found it a really incredibly powerful video, and I hadn't seen it before actually, and they didn't tell me anything I don't know, and yet it's powerful. And what was particularly powerful to me was the part where they showed the Earth on sort of a lateral edge and showed how thin that atmosphere is. And boy, that illustrated to me something intellectually I know, but graphically, visually, I'd never seen before, how small that air is, how much we need to take care of it. I thought that was incredibly powerful in getting the message through.
One of the things we've learned from the kind of climate science, climate communication research is that really vivid images are extremely helpful, and that calling climate change either global warming or the greenhouse effect, which is what it was called for a really long time, had a kind of backfiring effect, because greenhouses are places where plants flourish, right? And so if you call it the greenhouse effect, it doesn't get across the severity of it. And so there's really interesting work on the ozone hole, right? Which is, from what I understand, not really even a hole, or it was pictured as sort of like a hole in the sky, which mobilized people in a way that the greenhouse effect couldn't do, because it was just not a great image for getting people mobilized. So I like the idea that that seeing how thin the air is might actually give us that sense of vulnerability that we need. And we need images of it. It's very hard to give great images of climate change, and we see the same ones over and over again. So we see the glaciers falling into the ocean, we see the lonely polar bears starving away, but we don't have great images for our own vulnerability. And so I think that I really endorse the idea that that's part of what makes that so popular. I mean, so powerful.
Yeah, I agree with what you guys are saying. I think to add that the image of the atmosphere thinning is powerful because people are able to connect with what they're already dealing with. Like literally we can feel the effects of global warming happening. And so they have this image that they can connect it to. And I think that's powerful. Sorry, you guys are glitching out a little bit.
That's okay. We can still hear you. Hopefully you can hear us.
Okay.
Yeah, no, we're all good, but thank you for letting us know. I think all of your points are great, and this kind of bridges to our next question. But talking about, for instance, Professor Howarth, you mentioned, of course, you're an expert in this information. You know the facts, but the power of seeing that thin layer around the earth, it's, you know, it strikes a chord in all of us. And so that takes us to the next question about looking at how we can frame the story or the concept of the climate crisis in different ways to communicate different elements of it, and to potentially show people a new angle or perspective that they hadn't thought of before. And so that's our next question. And this is kind of transitioning more into the specifics of storytelling. But if you all could talk about, for instance, and I think we're going to start this one off with Professor Levine, because I know from her class that she talks all about form and communicating climate change. But how, or what different forms of communication can you use to frame climate change in specific ways that may be more effective with certain people?
Yeah, it's my favorite question because I'm a student of stories. That's my field, is what we call narratology or narrative theory, the study of stories and how they work. And again, the climate communications research suggests that stories are really effective, but they don't give us a lot beyond that. And I find that a really interesting kind of temptation to ask more questions, because which stories are effective and what are we telling stories of? And a lot of stories, it seems to me, and this is something that I focus on in my class, a lot of stories end with some kind of lesson or some kind of awareness, but not with an action plan. And so they don't necessarily mobilize you to action. So what is it that's effective about stories? Well, a couple of things. Stories are always about change over time. That's what a story is. That's its form. And so anytime we're trying to make sense of where we've been and where we're going, we need stories. And what resonates most with a lot of us in our own culture today are stories on the human scale, usually individual stories. And so people are often very moved by the story of somebody being hit personally by climate change in a way that is worrying to me. First of all, I love stories and I want to get those stories out. But on the other hand, why do we have to have actual suffering already happen to act? We're actually trying to prevent suffering on a huge scale. And so if we have to have this kind of first person witnessing, I'm afraid we're not going to get to where we need to be in terms of preventing that from happening in the future. Now, we're in a good moment right now in terms of having enough stories of people personally being hit by climate change, but not so many that we have the end of civilization that we can maybe work in this space to produce really powerful stories. But it does worry me. And stories on the human scale are also, there are two problems with them. One is that climate change is not happening on the human scale, it's happening on the global scale. And we do need to talk about the science, that is how the atmosphere actually changes, which is not on the human scale, either temporally or spatially, right? It's huge, vast timescales, right? And space scales. So that's one problem with traditional storytelling. So can we come up with stories that really bring home the story of climate change itself? But the other is, if we tell stories on the individual scale, are we going to end up with individual action at the end? And individual action we've all heard about it, right? We've all heard you should recycle more, you should stop eating meat, you should not drive your car, you should ride a bike. And we also know that those individual level actions are not going to add up fast enough or substantially enough really to stop the work of climate change. And so can we tell stories that get us to collective action as opposed to individual action? And what kind of stories do we need to get there?
And then we're going to do a little interactive activity in a second. But first, Professor Howarth or Destiny, would you guys like to add to what Professor Levine said or highlight something else?
Let me add just a little bit more. I mean, Caroline did a great job. She's a master at storytelling, and it's wonderful to get that perspective. You know, I mentioned I've taught climate change for decades, 40 plus years, and I mentioned my motivation going way back, but quite frankly, even though I understood it was going to happen at some point in the future, you could see it happening, you could see the evidence, you could pull it together. It was still an abstraction to me. We weren't seeing the consequences of it. And so when it really started to come home and you go, oh my God, what I've talked about as an abstraction is playing out, was Katrina or Superstorm Sandy or the massive fires or the droughts or something. And you know, that's what's bringing it home to people. But that gives you the opportunity to tie it back to the sort of global action context, I think. And one other aspect that I don't want to make sure we don't lose here is the one that Destiny brought up, where she tied it initially to the air pollution in her community. And, you know, the damage which is done by air pollution from fossil fuels is far more immediate and far larger than what climate change has done so far. You know, in the state of New York, 4,000 people die prematurely every year due to air pollution, and people are sick and home, and it costs us billions of dollars and plus human lives. It's terrible. So climate change is getting worse and worse and worse, but moving against fossil fuels, there's also that immediacy that we should tie to it, and people are starting to tie to it. Bringing the environmental justice movement into the climate change movement, I think, has been an incredibly positive thing to do. And the only other thing I'd say about storytelling is that if we can deliver a message, I'm going to use message instead of story so people don't say I'm telling stories. Bad word for a scientist. If we can message the positive side of it. At this point in time, moving 100% away from fossil fuels to a 100% renewable powered economy is real, it's affordable, it's better for the economy, it's better for public health, it moves us to where we need to go. Mr. Biden is messaging that, it's great. And I think that's the way forward. It's not, individual actions are fine, ride your bike when you can, do what you want with your diet. But Caroline's right, we need to act as a society, and you need, I think, a positive vision to do that, not just the negative. But it's there through this transition, which also deals with the local air pollution issues.
Destiny, anything to add? So much is amazing things you said.
I just want to thank you for bringing up the connection to fossil fuels, because I remember when I first got involved in like the environmentalist realm, like the big push was to like save the forest or like save the polar bears, and that's really important. But we were coming in from the perspective of like a decade is shaved off of our lives because of where we live, and that the EJ movement wasn't like fully formed when I first got involved. And so like I just wanted to say that I appreciated you mentioning that, because when we're talking about telling stories and relating this major crisis to people's immediate experiences, when people are dealing with things like police brutality or homelessness or living next to the polluting environment, all of these things are correlated. And I think if we're able to show people that all of these things are connected to the crisis, to different types of injustice, then that's one major story that everyone can connect to.
Amazing. We have so many different ways we could go, and we will get to them eventually. But directly going off of Destiny, what you just were talking about, specifically looking at environmental injustice and how that relates to racial injustice. We received a question a few days ago, specifically from an organization on Cornell's campus called Climate Justice Cornell. And they really wanted us to bring up the issue of how communities of color are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. And so I guess we can start off with Destiny, but they want to ask, how can we make sure that those narratives are included in the broader conversation of the climate crisis and are given the attention and respect that they deserve?
If we were to look at today a map of the US and where the most polluted communities are, they are across the board communities of color or poor communities. And when the effects of climate change hit, they hit hardest in those communities. And so in communities like mine that have faced and are continuing to face the brunt of these issues, we need to be at the forefront of the climate change movement. Sorry, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it does. And thank you. And I think later on we'll get into specifically your experience in your community and how you guys mobilized. Before we go on to go ahead, Professor Howarth.
Yeah, if I could just add, because I think that's a really important point, and I'll bring up the example of New York State, where we now have this CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which became law in 2019. It took over in January 1st. It specifies we need to move away from all fossil fuels statewide. It talks about the climate need to do so. It talks about the air pollution and environmental justice aspect of that. It sets real targets. They're the most aggressive targets in the country for doing so. And it specifies two things. It specifies that at least 40% of all of the economic investment which would go on this has to be focused primarily on disadvantaged communities and communities of color. And it sets up a mechanism to make sure that happens. It has a council that deals specifically with the environmental justice aspect that has to weigh in on every single decision. And I'm part of the process which institutes that. We've been working for about 15 months now. And I'm really quite pleased at how well that has been. It really is a game changer for how state agencies think about it. But so two things: A, it's possible to start making these transitions, and B, that law, which is really progressive, never would have passed without support from the environmental justice community. It did not come just from environmentalists caring about polar bears, it just plain didn't. And so I think that tying of the two is absolutely critical.
And now if it's good with you, Professor Levine, we're going to transition to the interactive activity. So this stems from what we've been talking about, the importance of making sure that communities are heard, and if you're a part of that community or you're advocating with another community, that we can advocate successfully, and that involves going from the individual level to the community and the institutional level. And so that's something that I think all of our panelists have mentioned. And so to show you that example of how you can take something personally relevant to you and then bring it to an institutional level where you can affect greater change, we're going to go with an example. And so basically, Professor Levine, you can kind of describe it for us, but it'll involve some audience participation. So if you'd like to participate, please raise your hand in one of your little reaction functions, or you can direct message Rachel or Margot.
Great, thanks, Allie. So I think probably everybody who's here in this conversation is able to tell a story like destinies or like Bob's about how they got involved in climate action, and how they got to care about the environment. So the first job is just to brainstorm what for you was a moment or an experience that really transformed your relationship to the climate. Was there something that got you feeling like this was a crucial high priority, especially some personal experience? So think for a second about that. And then what I want us to do, and I'll ask for a volunteer, is to tell that story, but to end the story not with you, the individual person, and your experience, but with an action that you could imagine taking that would involve working at the collective scale. So, you know, take the example of, you know, my older child, when he was in 7th grade, wrote to our congressman and said that he was worried that Florida, where his grandmother lived, was going to be underwater, and that's why it soon, and he wouldn't be able to go back there as an adult to vacation and see his grandma. So how do you get from there, which is moving, and in fact the congressman actually responded to my 7th grade child saying, wow, I was moved by that. How do you get from there to action? What's the bridge in the story that you tell from your personal experience to action that's not just, and then I gave up meat, or and then I even, you know, even voting, right? I think voting is really important, but it's still a kind of individual level. Can you scale that up to something? Can you imagine scaling that feeling or experience up to some action at a larger scale? We kind of know Destiny has that story, but if there's anybody else, so I could use you as our guinea pig, Destiny, but if there's anybody who'd like to volunteer, we can kind of walk you through it. Well, Destiny, do you mind if I try to pull the story out of you the way that I'm imagining? So
yeah,
let's talk about what a personal experience that was really troubling or scary or transformative that you can really describe in some detail that got you on this path.
So in high school, I was a part of a group with my friends that we named For Your Voice. And we just talked about injustice in general, everything from housing to homelessness and healthcare, things like that. And I remember my friend Jai, he we had just learned about the incinerator, and my friend Jai, we were trying to what if anything we could do regarding the incinerator. This is before we did like in-depth research. This is before we reached out to the community. The project had been going on for several years, but it hadn't been constructed yet. And so our government, our governor and our mayor and our city council members all supported it. And we were like, what? There's nothing we can do. And my friend Jai said, if we don't do something about this incinerator, then there's no point to our group. What's the point of looking at the injustices that we're facing if we don't do anything about it? And that really struck me. And I think his sentiment, like, wow, I'm crying, sorry. Like it pushed me to become that activist that I am today. That really affected me. So
that's, oh yes, that's so very moving.
Wow.
I want to even make you cry some more, Destiny. Right? But could you talk about why? So already we have the core of a really beautiful story. Talk about why you and your friends were so focused on injustice already. Was there some particular moment or experience that you that galvanized you to become, to start that group of conversations in the first place?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So this is, wow, you're like pulling it out of me. So we went to go see a play, a field trip, called An Enemy of the People. And if you haven't seen that play or read it, it's brilliant. And it talks about a community that is forced to make a decision between whether to allow, there's a polluted hot spring that people bathe in and drink from. It's also a tourist attraction. And so the community gets money from people coming to visit this hot spring, but it's also dying from it. And so they're forced to choose between whether or not they want to live in poverty and lose the hot spring, or continue to suffer. And so that really got us thinking about the kind of decisions that we're being forced to make in our own community. And we started analyzing injustice in our neighborhood. And then we found out about the incinerator.
Oh my gosh. So you couldn't possibly make me happier, because you know, I'm an English professor. And so you went to see a play, and this guy you're talking about injustice, and then this guy who acted. Okay, so then your friend really inspired, really kind of like changes your mind, right? Like resets you, right? And then you think to yourself, but how can I get my voice heard? Like, who am I? I'm a high school student, right? Who's going to listen to me? Did you feel powerless?
I did. Yeah.
And so how did you overcome that? What was the story of getting involved?
Well, thankfully we had each other to rely on, and we had this amazing mentor, Greg, who really pushed us to not give up, to keep trying. And we ended up reaching out to lawyers and experts in the environment, and we analyzed our community, and we found reports about the pollution in our community, and we did more research about the incinerator. And then we were like, holy shit, let's go tell the community. And so we did, and then it just built and built.
This is the most amazing story. So was I think this is one of the great I feel like there are a couple things in that story that we could generalize to everybody, right? It's really hard. People say one person can change the world. It's actually much easier if you have a few people, even 4, right? Like, it doesn't have to be 20. It can be 4, and somebody who tells you not to give up. Because did people tell you to give up, Destiny? Did people tell you not to bother?
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. So many people, they're like, listen, like this plant or this plan is green, it has so much money behind it. Like, there's just focus on school. Don't worry about this, you know?
Yep.
It was like, I can't, like, so many people were just like, just focus on school and get out of the community. Just move out of the community. And I'm like, no, I shouldn't have to move out of the community. I want to fight for this.
Yeah, so, that's amazing. That is amazing. Yeah. So we've got a group of people. Part of your story is that a group of people are supporting each other against wins of people saying, you can't change anything. You'll never make a difference. You're not big enough or powerful enough or rich enough to make a difference.
Yeah.
And yet you did. Yay!
Yeah.
So did you, when you were gathering support from the community, and I love what we often think networking has kind of a bad name. It's like what business people do, but actually that's part of what it sounds like you were doing. You were connecting with people and asking them for their wisdom and their help and their experience, and just gathering, right? And trying to figure that out. So did you organize something at the community level that then so what was that?
So we did a lot of things. We organized some community events to just build membership and just get to know each other, stuff like game nights. We had retreats where we'd go off into the forest and play games and think critically about justice and what that means. So many activities, oh my gosh. And then we'd come back into the community and we'd start over. Those leaders that we built up would go back and find more people, and then they would become leaders through that process. And yeah.
Fantastic. So so that's a story of beginning small and very much developing to a larger scale with an ending that I think is super inspiring for others. So so telling that kind of story is really different from telling a story of gloom or doom, as Bob mentioned, which often turns people off and makes them want to act less, or a story at the really small scale, like, and that's why I always recycle, because that's often where our stories end. And so trying to figure out how to tell these stories of basically building power is the one that is going to make the most difference probably in the storytelling.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much to the both of you. That was a beautiful exercise. Destiny knocked it out of the park. Professor Levine, great job as well. Destiny's story is absolutely amazing. And if you all would like to learn more, we are going to provide you with an action list at the end, and we're going to provide some resources where you can learn more about all of our speakers. And that includes a feature with, I believe, Robert Redford narrating about Destiny Watford. But so now we're going to somewhat transition to looking at the policy component of advocacy, but still very much sticking with the importance of institutions. And so I think, Professor Levine, when you were talking to Destiny in that exercise, you were talking about how, you know, people saying, oh, you can't change something, you can't do it, and then you end up doing it. And Destiny, your experience is amazing, but both Professor Levine and Professor Howarth, you guys also deserve credit because you have done some amazing things as well. So I'd like for us to talk a little bit about both your involvement in divesting the Cornell University endowment last year, because you both were integral to that. And then we'll move on kind of to policy at larger levels. But for right now, sticking at this institutional level, Professor Howarth, if we could please begin with you. You can provide a bit of background if you'd like, but the main focus is looking at the importance of collaboration and working with people who may not share your opinion, may not want to divest the endowment. Basically, how did you navigate those relationships? And how did you use compromise and collaboration to achieve divestment?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me give you a little bit of the historical perspective, and Caroline can give you perhaps more of the detail on the compromises and communication. You know, the move to divest from fossil fuels at Cornell started with the student community, and started from the student communities in 2013 or 2014, the Kyoto Now movement. And eventually it worked its way up through student government and into faculty government and employee assembly sort of things. And, you know, through those governmental agencies, the community as a whole asked the trustees to divest from fossil fuels in 2015. And the trustees took it seriously enough that they did not say no immediately. They took 6 months to say no. They took it under advisement. They decided they weren't going to do it. It's just too radical of a step for them in 2016. By then it had become. And they basically said, oh, you know, if we divest from fossil fuels, then we're going to have to divest from everything that people bring to us. And so they dismissed the idea, and they also set up a very difficult way that they'd ever consider anything again. They basically said, we're not going to consider future divestment issues unless all of the 5 parts of campus shared governance have exactly the same resolution that they bring to us. So that's the student assembly, the graduate and professional student assembly, the employee assembly, the faculty senate, and the university assembly. It represents everyone. That's impossible to do, right? So it kind of went away. Well, a bunch of people, again, I think primarily coming from the students, started to question that again, circa 2017 or 18. There was a year of sort of hopelessness. The trustees said, no, we can't do anything. But people said, well, let's push, let's think about it and all. And, you know, a group of us working through campus governance, the university assembly in this case, virtually brought Bill McKibben to campus. We did that in March of 2019. We couldn't convince them, this was pre-COVID, so this wasn't a COVID issue for virtual, but we couldn't convince them to come in person. We did convince them to talk to us in the community. We got called auditorium, and we got an audience of a few hundred people, and he talked to us, and there was momentum coming out of that for it. And there's a lot of student involvement. In particular, Caroline worked very closely with the students, so she can give a little more detail on that. eventually we brought divestment back through the campus governance structure in the following year, 2019 to 20. And we did it by, again, you have to have exact same resolution in all 5 bodies. That's impossible to do, and the trustees knew it was impossible to do. So we came up with a strategy. A bunch of us talked and came up with a strategy of having a resolution that was astronomically short. You should divest, basically, saying nothing more than that. So people can't really debate it and put in qualifiers and all, because then it would be a different resolution. And then we said, in support of this, there should be a white paper that expresses all of our views. And Caroline graciously took on the job as a storyteller, as a writer, of writing this white paper of why Cornell should divest, why we should divest ethically, why we should in our own business interests, why we should if we want to get the best students, because we need to project that we actually care about the environment, not just give lip service to it, all of those reasons. And Caroline's paper in the end was 17 pages long, something like that. Very, very powerful document. All of the assemblies endorsed their very, very short resolutions with the identical short little language. The trustees were already paying attention. President Pollock and the head of the trustees had read Caroline's paper before the assemblies even took a vote. They're already paying attention. They're already thinking about it. And so this sort of forced them to do something. And they were supposed to, in March of last year, March of 2020, take a vote again. And of course, COVID got in the way. They canceled the board meeting and nothing happened. And my opinion at the time was nothing's going to happen this year because they're preoccupied with other things. And they have a perfect excuse not to deal with the resolutions we've all brought to them. But they took it seriously enough that in May, they actually passed the resolution and they did divest. A little bit of compromise there. They never used the divestment word. They described the actions they're taking, which were divestment, without using the D word. And that was the compromise they needed to get through in order to get their more conservative trustees to sign off. They checked with us in campus governance first to make sure we weren't going to complain about that. And I said, hell no, we're going to advertise that Cornell's divesting because that's what you're doing. And Martha Pollock, the president, who broke the news to me that the trustees were going to do this, said, well, that's exactly right. Feel free to advertise it, but they're not going to use that word. That's the background. And I'll let Caroline, because she was instrumental in keeping a lot of that organization going, and she is the storyteller. And quite frankly, I think it's her paper that convinced the trustees more than the resolutions. So, but it was a group, and students were critical all along the way.
It was absolutely a group effort. I am so moved to think that my writing mattered. I know when I sat down to write that white paper, I thought to myself, I've written 3 books. This is the most important writing I'll ever do in my life, is trying to persuade the trustees to divest the endowment. I thought, and part of the reason I asked Destiny about whether people had told her to give up, I found it incredible how many people told us to stop, not to bother. I thought that was really, really remarkable. And if it hadn't been for Bob saying, no, I actually think this might work, several times, crucial moments in the year, I think I would have been gloomy and despondent and wouldn't have kept my energy up. And so that's part of the story for me, was just that sense that it's worth doing, even when, I'm a little sister, and my older brother would always tell me, "Oh, don't bother with that." So I believe people when they say, "Don't do that, don't bother, that's too hard." And so it was really hard to persuade myself that it was worth doing, even though all kinds of people said, "Oh, the trustees will never go for this. Cornell will never divest," and they would say these opposite things like, "Oh, there's so much money in the Cornell endowment and fossil fuels that the whole place will collapse if you divest." And then conversely, people would say, "There's so little money in the Cornell endowment that if you divest, it won't make any difference." It was like, well, we actually don't know how much money there is in the Cornell endowment, but we would like to send the message that none of our money should be in these destructive companies that have lied and smeared science and are bringing on planetary destruction for our students, for sure. So. To me, part of what was crucial too was figuring out how to work the institution and understanding what its different parts were and how to get them to collaborate. I felt like, being a person who studies the arts, it was a little bit more like an orchestra than it was like writing a poem. It was like getting all the musicians to work together to produce this object. And so having students, we had the president or chair of the staff assembly was somebody who'd worked in Washington. He was like, oh yeah, I can get the staff to vote for this, right? And so his politicking experience was really crucial, and having the students do direct action so that it felt like the pressure was on, like all of these pieces were working together.
Let me just chime in a little bit on the direct action, because there were many things which happened, but one thing is that students, I think it was December of 2019, just before Caroline's paper was released, but people in Day Hall knew it was coming along. They knew by and large what we were doing. And a bunch of students sat in on Martha Pollock's office. And I saw her, I think the next day, we were both at the same Christmas party somewhere in the vet school, and we both arrived a little bit late. So we walked in the door together late, and she graciously said hello. But then she said something to the effect of, why were your students sitting in my office? To which I responded, Caroline, they're not my students, they're all of our students. We should take pride in them. I'm glad they did it, by the way. They have your attention, So, and she laughed. I mean, it got her attention. It really did. That made a difference. Couldn't just do that. We needed the white paper. We needed the political momentum, but the direct action, I think, was a good thing. I know it caught her attention.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'll say, and thank you so much for talking about the divestment. It is amazing that basically it was a one-year turnaround, which is amazing at any institution, but especially Cornell, which is quite large. But I think another thing that's quite important from that story is just that everyone had a role to play. And if it hadn't been for everyone, it probably would not have happened. Where you have the students applying the pressure and being annoying and sitting in someone's office, or lying across the street, all those different types of things. And then also you have, the scientists, the environmental teachers or professors who are coming with the facts, with the information. And then you have the professors from the humanities departments who are coming and creating the story. So I think that's a wonderful show of teamwork and how everyone has a role to play, and that you can make a difference if you work together. I just do want to make sure, Destiny, I want to know if you have anything to add. I know that you cut out for a second, but we are basically just talking about divestment in general and the collaboration required. And so I know with the incinerator, for instance, I may not have, I don't know if you necessarily use the word divest from the incinerator, but
no, we did.
Oh, okay. Divest from the incinerator. But just if you could please talk a bit about, because this is a different scale, but just going through your community and talking to people and trying to encourage them to pressure those politicians, because I know you went to the school board as well as to individuals in the community. So if you could please talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so a couple of years into our campaign, we found out that 22 public institutions would be purchasing energy from the incinerator. This included the Baltimore City Public School System, which we were a part of, public libraries, in lots of institutions. And so we went to each of those institutions, and we were talking about the different ways that supporting the incinerator violated the very premise of their being, the institution. Like, the point of education is to think critically about the world, which is what we were doing, and only to find out that the very same system that was supporting us and encouraging us to do this would be purchasing energy from the very same thing that was trying to kill us, or could kill us. So we went to each of those institutions and they dropped out like flies, So they were really moved by what we had to say. So
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for your stories. It's inspiring. And it's also great to see how one individual can catalyze a movement or join the movement and help it be a part of that change. We are getting towards actually our Q&A section. Before we go there, we're going to talk a bit about some actions. But before that, we're going to share a video clip from the end of the Leaders Summit on climate. So I believe if Margot or Rachel, if you all are able to share screen, that would be great. Sorry, give us a second.
You know, to confront this crisis before it's too late. I know we can seize the opportunities of a cleaner, stronger, and more resilient economy and deliver the benefits to people in each of our nations. So I look forward to working alongside you to confront the climate crisis, to build a better world for all of our children and grandchildren. We're going to do this together. Thank you all, and may God bless you, and let's get to work. Thanks again. Thanks, everybody.
We know the kind of world we want. Healthier,
There we go. I'm unmuted now. The video cut out. Those are just some closing remarks from President Biden. I highly recommend that you guys check out that both either the summit, that's quite long, it's 2 days, but check it out. It is an interesting. And in the summit, they talked a lot about actions that the U.S. is taking to, have our emissions during the summit. Japan, as well as Canada, also talked about at least, I believe, 49 to 50% reductions in their emissions compared to 2005 levels. So we're seeing this type of progress or these types of policies at the national, international level, which is great, and we need those. But we also have a role to play. So as constituents, we can pressure those politicians. And yes, we need action at the institutional level, but there are also things that we can all do right now and that we need to do because we don't have time to say, oh, well, they'll handle it. And so that's going to take us to one of our last questions before the Q&A section. But to our panelists, we'd like to ask you all, if you had one actionable step or piece of advice that you could provide to our audience members that you could give that they could implement today, what would that be? And let's start with Professor Levine.
A hard one, Allie. I mean, I think I'm not sure that I'm gonna fudge this. There are lots of actionable steps. I think figuring out, to my mind, what's been most important is figuring out what the most effect for my time and energy is, like the biggest bang for my buck is. And so to my mind, that's been thinking institutionally, it's been thinking about where I have the most knowledge, the most contacts, the most impact, but above the scale of just me and my family, and so Cornell or Ithaca or New York State, that's the kind of scale I've been thinking at. And just thinking about what kinds of problems could be solved. And to me, the money has been the place where I've thought that we could have the most impact, stopping the money from flowing to politicians from fossil fuels or to fossil fuels from endowments, right? Like the money is flowing in all of these ways. Can we just stop it? And so, one possibility is to send some money to a campaign finance reform organization like Common Cause. Another is to get involved with thinking about divesting whatever institutions you're involved in, schools, churches, retirement funds. So yeah, thinking about the money, I think, is where I would start.
Wonderful. Destiny and Professor Howarth?
I could go next. I, a couple of years ago, was in took part in a film festival in Missouri, and folks from Ferguson had created a documentary about the police brutality that occurred there. And when asked by the public how best for allies to assist in their movement, they said, get in where you fit in. And that to me has been my advice for folks ever since. Like what you were saying, people have lots of different things that they're passionate about. And so whatever that is for you, make sure that you fold in your activism into what you're doing. Just make it a part of it, if that makes sense.
Those are both really great answers. I really like that. Fit in, where you can. It's wonderful. Let me tell you something that I think is important that people can contribute to that I've been pushing, and it goes back to the positive message that I raised earlier. We can have a world that doesn't use fossil fuels. We can get rid of that air pollution, and we can get rid of that aspect of climate change. And climate change is overwhelmingly a fossil fuel issue. We can do it through renewable transitions. And I'm not deeply expert in that area, but I felt it was important to try to push it. And I helped write a peer-reviewed paper that was published back in 2013 that laid the case for how we do it in New York State. And that became the Solutions Project. And there are now plans for all 50 states. And people were paying attention then, so the state legislature noticed that, and they started working on this thing that became the CLCPA back in 2014. There's a lot of other inputs to it, but, we helped lay the intellectual underpinnings of that. And AOC was paying attention to that. And the Green New Deal is, again, a much broader thing. Environmental justice is core to it and all, but in terms of the technical thought that you can actually do it, it comes from those underpinnings. And so, do what you can to fit in. And now, President Biden, he doesn't use the word Green New Deal, but man, his infrastructure plan and what he's talking about has all of the elements in there. And it's, you can trace some of the roots back to that, to what we proposed, and we demonstrated. So to the extent you can contribute in any way, you should. And for everyone, I think recognizing that the details of how we make the transition are really important. And there are ways that one can pay attention to that and influence those details. Here in New York, we have the Environmental Justice Council, which plays a big role. Let them know what you think. I also think it's important when things are going weird and it looks like it's going to be bought out by corporate interests that we give pushback. But on the other hand, when things are going well and someone really does something that's good, we should congratulate the people who do that publicly as a community, as broadly as we can. We should celebrate what the Biden administration is doing. It's incredible, and they should be congratulated on that, and we should let them know. We shouldn't look like we're nickel and diming them all the time. I think that's really important, and everyone can contribute in that way. But pay attention to the detail and fit in where you can. It's great advice.
I think all of you, words of wisdom, absolutely so useful, and truly that can be implemented by all of us. And just going off from Professor Howarth's point about the Biden administration, one thing I think is interesting, which we've noticed here, and when we're talking about divestment, but the importance of wording, of how certain concepts are okay, but if we call it divestment, it might get some more pushback. Or if we call it the Green New Deal, it'll get more pushback. So I think that's something that's interesting and also good for all of us to consider, is that sometimes people have preconceptions about what something is based off of the word that it's given. And so if you try approaching it from a different direction, you don't call it divestment, you say, well, we shouldn't allow these fossil fuel companies, to have their money in our endowment, or other ways you can go about it. You may actually find consensus, and that you guys are really on the same page. You're just using different words. And so now we're going to go to our questions. And so I believe that Iris, Mary Bloom, has a question. So Iris, if you could please just tell us a bit about yourself, about your story, and what question that you have for our panelists. And it sounds like she may have just dropped off. Professor Levine and I, we know Iris. She's part of TIAA Divest, and she's awesome. So we'll give her a second, but if she's not able to come on, then I believe we have an audience question for Destiny. So this is sent via chat from Chloe. She says, this question is for Destiny, parentheses, hi, Destiny, exclamation point. But really anyone can take it up. I know from your work in Baltimore how much work goes into crafting a story of the problem to your audience or to the audience that you hope to mobilize. So can you talk a bit about how you've tailored your message to move fellow residents, policymakers, regulators, donors, and other stakeholders? So thank you, Chloe, and Destiny, go ahead.
That's a really good question. So the mold of the story stayed the same. There's a problem. Here's how we're trying to fix it. When we talked to community members, we said, here's a problem. Here's what we're doing to help it. And here's how you can help. There was a lot more listening about their experiences and how they related to the issue, and giving them lots of options to get in where they fit in. When it came to like policymakers or politicians, we were a lot more stringent. We stated the problem, what we were doing to help it, and what they needed to do. Like it was more of holding them accountable. Like we wanted to work with them 100%, but when it came to policymakers, we needed to make sure that accountability was at the forefront. So that's our message changed depending on that, and how they responded to our initial ask. What else? Our arguments for policymakers, politicians, folks in power were essentially the same. They changed depending on what their roles were. Like if we were talking to a business, then we definitely wanted to work with them and become allies in the community, because the incinerator would also be affecting them. So I don't know that answers the question. Did you want me to go into detail about how we would do that, or?
I think it does answer the question. Maybe if you could provide one example of an interaction, that would be great. And then we can go on to another question that we have from an audience member.
Okay. Well, with a politician, we might, or a policymaker, we might say something like, last legislation, you passed such and such bill, which you did this, and it was catastrophic for the community because of this. We want to work with you to make sure that we, protect the community, put our needs first. And if they decide not to, there are consequences for that. So.
Yeah, no, it's helpful just to hear an example, because sometimes I think we can have, a very small version of, writer's block where you don't necessarily know how to get started. So that was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And it's also important to provide a carrot and a stick when you're talking to politicians, and you're their constituents. So it's their job to listen to you. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but it is. So now we're going to move on to, and if we're all good, we're gonna move on to our next question, which is from Iris. So there was a little bit of wait, but now you get to hear the question. So her question is for all panelists. She says, how do you get the point across that pace and timing matter? More people are not in total denial, but they think that it's being handled, or that it's not a race against time. So how do we communicate this? And why don't we start off with Professor Howarth?
Sure, that's a great question, and it's one that I think about a lot. And so, there is huge urgency. The climate damage is real. The air pollution damage is real. The climate damage is getting worse. It's not irreversible now. If we continue on this path, it could become irreversible. The chances of doing that as we warm over another decade or three makes it a much, much riskier proposition. And so there's a real sense of urgency for those reasons. And we're already seeing, with the fires, the floods, the superstorms, that's really bad, and it kills people, it's damaging. There's also, research by our colleague at Cornell, Ariel Ortiz Babola, has shown that globally food production is now 20% less than it would have been if we had not had climate change in there. Then that's bad, and it's particularly plays out in places like Guatemala and Honduras. And part of the reason we have refugees leaving that area is because of the climate change devastating their agricultural communities, and there's an urgency to that. So I think conveying all of that is part of what I try to do, but you also have to convey that we can respond urgently. We can make this transition to renewables. If it was just, you can't do anything about it, it's terrible, then you get into this gloom again, and that leads to inaction. We can make this transition. And there are all sorts of examples. One of my favorites is that if you go back to early 20th century, circa 1915, 1920, 95% of personal transportation was horse and buggy, 5% was automobile. And I'm not sure I like automobiles, but I'll tell you, it only took 12 years for that transition to go over, and 95% of people were moving around in automobiles later. And they didn't have the first automobile to get that started. They took horse-drawn carriages, and they still steered with the reins, just on a pulley system to the front wheels. They strapped an engine on the back, and the brake was a wooden stick that you pulled against the wooden wheel. That's what the first cars looked like. 10 years later, the transition is there, and we improved along the way. We didn't wait for rack and pinion steering. We didn't wait for disc brakes before we started. And it happened fast. So we have the technologies to do it with renewable energy. I think we can move in the same time frame. We do have the capacity to 90% get rid of fossil fuels in the time frame of 10 to 15, 20 years from now. And that's what it takes. It's doable. So there's the double urgency. If we don't do it, it really is a problem. It's not too late, but let's not wait till it is too late. And by the way, it's not hopeless. If we get together, we can do it.
Destiny or Professor Levine, would you guys like to add on?
I keep thinking Destiny's going to speak. Are you about to speak, Destiny? Can't quite tell. No, maybe the connection is hard.
No, go for it.
I think this is one of our biggest problems, because I think some people are really motivated by urgency, right? And they think, okay, it's time to act right now. And a lot of those people are involved in the climate movement, and a lot of other people are not motivated by it at all. And they feel like, oh, it'll fix itself somehow, or maybe it's just made up, or, it's definitely true that some problems, I know this as a department chair, if you wait long enough, they just go away. You don't actually have to deal with them. So I think we have these mental filters for persuading ourselves that we don't have to act now. And I think it's really, climate change is this wicked problem, in part because if we wait for it to hit us, we've waited too long, in lots of cases. And so air pollution is actually a perfect way to work towards climate change with immediate impacts now that aren't actually the same as global warming, but they work together to think about fossil fuels. So I love Bob's idea that we should be thinking about the urgency of our action. I do feel like a lot of us feel like, oh, if we try to do X or Y, it'll just take so long that it won't be worth doing either, right? What are some actions, as you asked, Ali, that we could do right now that would be at the scale and pace that's required by climate urgency? And for me, one of the answers, and this is something you and I have talked about, is carbon pricing, right? That it's shown that if you put a price on carbon, that brings emissions down really fast, because it provides an immediate economic incentive to people to shift away from fossil fuels and towards renewables. But a lot of people in the environmental movement have worried that that's too much of a market mechanism, and it kind of continues the logic of capitalism and extractivism. And I just want to say that my own view, having thought about this in various different ways, is that the perfect is the enemy of the good, and that we should do the things that bring down emissions quickly, because there is this framework of urgency. We can't wait to work out all the kinks before we begin to solve the problems. And so I think there are a lot of solutions that we could do that aren't perfect, but that help us get toward the goal. As I like to say, let's preserve human beings long enough to try socialism for real. So we don't have to have the revolution right now. We do have to have it, but we may have to work with the market between now and then.
Destiny's cracking up. Destiny, if you'd like to add anything, go ahead.
Yeah, that was hilarious, and thank you. I can bring it back to the community. When I talk to people, sorry, I'm still thinking about that joke. Whoa, sorry. I forgot the question. Can you repeat the question?
About urgency, about...
Yeah. I think Professor Levine, you should go into stand-up comedy.
So yeah, when I would talk to people in the community about how important the issue was, a lot of them had kids or siblings that were dealing with asthma, or know someone that has lung cancer, like they were affected personally. And in South Baltimore, where my community existed or exists, we could expect an entire decade to be shaved off of our lives just because of where we lived, and due in part to the pollution. And so people saw how important this was in the community and that it needed to be solved like now. But when I went out to the counties or the folks that had a bit more wealth, it was more challenging. Like they were just like, yeah, it needs to be solved, but it doesn't need to be solved right now, right? Like there are other issues. To be perfectly honest, I remember early on in my organizer career, I and another activist who worked primarily out of West Baltimore, which has high levels of police activity. All of Baltimore does, but it's concentrated in the West. And a lot of murders happened there. A lot of police brutality happened there. And I remember talking to this fellow activist. I was talking about environmental justice. She was talking about police brutality. And she was like, we cannot deal with environmental justice right now. There are people dying in the streets. And that really struck me because we were divided in focusing on these other issues that were real and important, like they were critical to our dignity and our humanity, but at the same time, the incinerator and the environmental injustice that we were dealing with on a global level were equally as important. And so it was making sure that we connect all of these different levels of injustice, or different types of injustice, and see them as one issue together, and fight them actively together as one unit. Unless we can do that, people are going to continue to push back the EJ movement.
Yeah. No, I think everything that you said, they're quite profound. And I completely agree that we need to all work together to forwards, because once we kind of come together and have a sense of unity, we'll be able to forward all of our efforts and so much more quickly. And so I know that we are slightly over time. So we are going to wrap up our symposium for today. Thank you so much to our speakers who are here today. Please give a virtual applause for them. You guys, you're all truly motivating and inspiring. And I hope also thank you to our audience, everyone for coming. We really appreciate it. And we hope that you can take something away from this and feel as though you can apply some of the things that we've talked about today to your life and to your community to help fight the climate crisis. The document that was just, or this is to contact AdPro. So if you have any follow-up questions, because Q&A is now over, please contact AdPro and we are happy to send those questions on to our speakers. Just now in the chat, we also added our action list. So it's a Google document, and this provides you with a list of things that you can go and do right now to try to kind of kickstart, get kind of the wheels turning and figure out how you can have an impact at multiple levels, individual, community, institutional, etc. So again, thank you to everyone. AdPro is very grateful that you were here today. Please stay in touch with us. You can sign up for our newsletter via the link in the chat. And you can also follow us on social media. And please reach out again with any questions, and then enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.